Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. My name is Dave Nagel, and I am one of the authors on the PLC Plus texts and publications that have come out in the last year here at Corwin Press. I'm really, really excited. I'm going to have a chance to meet with all of you who are watching this. At least I would imagine most of you, the leadership team in Kimberly. I'm going to see you next August the 10th. So, and working with the team, kind of prepping for the day, I thought we designed just a quick overview. Some of this will be familiar, but just like we talk about flipping the classroom, it's a chance to kind of flip the professional development. So I'm going to give you just a short overview of some of the things we're going to talk about next week. And I figure that allows us to prepare coming in. Some of the examples and pieces that I'll talk about, I will obviously hit again next week, but I just thought this was a good chance for us to connect as we start coming into next week. And one of the things you're going to hear me say many times, when we dig into the essence of PLCs, and they're not a new idea, and no disrespect to the DeFores, because obviously they get a lot of notoriety, as they should, God rest their souls. They did more to put PLCs on the map than anybody else, and we're indebted to them in our profession. But the idea of a PLC has been around for a long time, since the 70s, as a matter of fact, with Bandura and some of his early research on collective efficacy. But the key with a PLC, and this is where I work with a lot of different schools and districts that might call them data teams or coaching teams or impact teams, whatever they want to call them. The bottom line is the L, and is learning taking place, and primarily the adults learning. Obviously, when we wake up every day as educators, our goal is to increase the learning of our students, but we are not a professional learning community unless we are learning together. So as we think about our own teams and the teams that we lead, that's got to be primary. And certainly, by default, the focus is, of course, on making sure our students are moving forward. But if we come together and we haven't learned from each other, then I would respectfully say we can't call that a professional learning community meeting. And we can go back to Shirley Hord and her work. She's affectionately known as the godmother of PLCs and collaboration. She passed away this past fall. She actually has an award from Learning Forward for the most prestigious, is a very prestigious award for schools across the country and the best collaborative efforts. And she has said that it comes down to these four things: that we're continuously learning, that there's the inquiry process that is happening that focuses on areas that need attention. And I think we could think about going into 2020 in this school year. There's going to be obviously some academic areas that we would focus on no matter what, that we might focus on more. And certainly we're going to focus on some social and emotional elements of our students and our teachers because of the world we're living in. But these are the purposes of why we would come together as a PLC. Now, certainly that doesn't mean we're not going to look at student data or look at student work and those things, but we have to make sure that these are the primary focus. And because of this, then we're going to use our data and assessment results from our students. So kind of a reflective question to one of my thoughts as you watch this. I'm not going to slow down and give long pauses. So you're welcome to pause the recording at any time. What's the impact of your PLCs? And what evidence do we have to know? And we're going to speak to these when we're together on site here next week, but these are really kind of the 5 overarching elements that get in the way. And I'm going to spend more time on them when we come together, but we make false assumptions. We assume that because people have been teaching for a long time, or that team's been together, or we increase the amount of collaboration time, or we give them a Google Doc to use, that any of those individual actions or even collective actions by default are going to lead to learning. It can be a place where we avoid change. Now, one of the things in our profession we should never adhere to by default is to say, just because we have done something for a long time, we should continue to do it. Nor just because we've been doing something for a long time doesn't mean we should necessarily change it. But are we using evidence to determine what our impact is? And that fourth bullet point happens a lot. We focus very much on the inputs, the things we did, and maybe less on what was the impact we should have seen with our students. So we're going to dig into these. It's going to be one of our early reflection prompts when I'm together with you on site, but it's definitely one I wanted to kind of plant the seed on, that I would imagine if we aren't feeling we're getting the impact that we know we could out of our collaborative teams, might some of these be a starting point as a way to kind of guide for some next steps. One of the things you're going to hear me say a lot is obviously, and I'm honored and humbled to be with authors like Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry and a few others, but we don't feel we've invented PLCs. We do feel that we've taken some of the great work that has happened before us and built upon it because of existing research and evidence. For example, I have an iPhone 7 and an iPhone 10. My iPhone 7 can make a phone call. It can send a text message. I can check the score of my White Sox because I'm a big White Sox fan, or the Colts because I'm from Indianapolis. What my iPhone 7 can't do is look at my face, recognize it, and turn itself on. Because at the time when that phone was built, the research wasn't available to do that. But the iPhone 10 can. So the point I am making, that iPhone 10 can still make a phone call. It can still send a text, and I can still check the White Sox score. But what we have in our work, we like to think, is some of the best evidence that is most current, that includes a lot of John Hattie's work, around what really impacts student learning and how we bring that together in a collaborative light. So this is not a new idea, but one that we would like to think we have built upon and taken what the evidence has been there before, and then used what is the most recent evidence of what moves learning forward. So of course that means we shouldn't throw baby bathwater, commode, toilet seat, toothbrush out. But what do we know is already existing and what effective PLC structures are? And maybe what are some nuances that are going to help us take our teams to the next level? What sets the PLC Plus apart? Well, the plus, if you haven't heard already, is you, is the teacher, is yourself as an administrator, if you're on an administrative leadership team that will be considered a PLC, but it's what we bring to the table individually that collectively we want to harness and scale up expertise. One of the things John Hattie says we need to do more in our schools is stop worrying about what isn't working and focus more on what is, and then scale that up. And so we're going to dig in, for those of us that are familiar with John Hattie's research and his barometer of influence, which in a nutshell, and again, I know this is review for some, but just in case, what Hattie has done synthesis or meta-analyses, studies upon studies. And what he's found is the average effect of everything we do is approximately 0.4. So 0.4 means about a year's growth in about a year's time. And so when we think about when we come together as a PLC, individually and collectively, what that means. One of the areas individually that I'm going to speak to give us a where can we take our teachers and see where they are is around ability. And this has been an important influence, 1.09, so more than double the average effect. But there's elements of making students. And if there was ever a time, it's going to be this school year, if we have age in any type of remote or distance education, because the more we are, the more we increase the chances of engaging with our students, which is even more important if we can't have access to them every day. And we're going to dig into these when we come together next week, of these 4 areas of trust, competence, being dynamic, and having immediacy. And as teachers, we need to have all 4 of them. And how do we as a collective then build upon those of us that are maybe better at building trust, and then shamelessly stealing from those others that might be really strong at dynamism, if that's not mine. But then what that is leading to, that example, is collective efficacy, 1.39. A lot of us are familiar with some of the work, Jenny Donahue, many others that have dug into this research. But it's that collective belief that we can considerably accelerate student achievement, but it's even more than that. It's more than just rah-rah thinking. It's, of course, that belief, but then it must get fueled with the evidence that we are. And as leaders, what we have to make sure we understand is that we promote collective efficacy by making sure these 4 elements and constructs are embedded in our schools. Experiences of mastery. The more teachers get good at things, the more they feel confident and competent in strategies that they're using, the more they're going to build that individual and then collective efficacy. And from that leads to social persuasion. You know, I'm actually digging into something and trying really hard and getting results, and someone else might be reluctant. That's going to lead to that social persuasion. And then we'll dig, as I said, into all 4 of these on a deeper level when we're together. But we promote collective efficacy by conditions that we put in place, not just by saying that team of 5 is going to meet 3 times a week. And I think we intuitively know this, but it's a great opportunity maybe to enhance some of our actions, or maybe if we acknowledge that there's a gap, it's one we could really focus on, especially going into this coming school year. So that was just a quick overview, and I'm glad we've got a hold next Monday to dig into kind of the underpin of what I like to say, the bedrock of what drives effective learning in teams. But now I'm going to take you just for a few minutes here into the construct, sort of the technical side. And in the PLC Plus framework, there are 5 questions that drive what we'll call an investigation cycle. An investigation cycle could be, from a classroom teacher or team's perspective, a semester, 6 weeks, a unit of study. For an administrative leadership team, it could be on a yearly basis, on a quarterly basis. And a couple of footnotes. We do not have 5 questions within our framework because others have had 4. there was some very strong intentionality that I'm going to walk you through here today, and certainly when we're together next Monday, as to why the framework was designed as it is. I will today, and then of course next week, walk through the 5 questions kind of in order, but they're not necessarily at all to be considered formulaic. And there is an intentionality that each question serves a purpose when we're at certain parts of our investigation cycles, when we're coming together and collaborating. But in addition, what's embedded through them are what we call 4 cross-cutting themes or values. Activators. Activators are those individuals on a team that make sure that the learning of the team moves forward. And activators are not facilitators, because by definition, a facilitator cannot be a member of the team. I could come in and facilitate your meeting because I'm not a member. I facilitate the discussion. Rarely does that happen in schools. The individuals who are leading the meetings are part of that team, so they must activate learning. And certainly the team leader, certainly most of the time, will assume that role, but it's not just one person is the only activator. And one footnote, one thing that an activator does is they allow people to vent. They allow people to share frustration. We got to make sure people feel honest and safe. But with lamenting, what they do is then they make sure we don't lament. We'll allow people to get it out, but we won't. We talk about what high expectation means level to be present in our classroom to challenge students. I've spoken at least a little bit about individual and collective efficacy. And the other thing that we feel very strongly about is we're the only PLC plus PLC model that has intentional specific focus on equity as part of the cycle, both in the value that's embedded throughout, and then in the 5th question, which we'll dig into, which is who benefited and who did not. So I want to take just a few minutes here to walk you through the 5 questions, which is just a little bit of an overview. You are welcome to complete the instrument that I've passed on, or wait until after we're together next week to complete that instrument. But the first question is, where are we going? And while bounce around at times from question to question based on where we are in our cycle, we're probably going to start each cycle with where are we going, which specifically ties to teacher clarity. 0.75 of its effect size, and it is more than just learning intentions and success criteria. That's a part of it. We establish what students will learn, we establish what successful attainment of that looks like, and we provide that to our students so they're aware. But the reason why we do this is not just so the kids know what they're learning. That's a part of it. The reason why we develop learning intentions and success criteria is because that should drive then what we do as teachers in terms of our formative assessment, our feedback, our instructional tools. If this is what we need our students to learn, then we need to better examine, is that the best worksheet? Is that the best video? Is that the best discussion? Just like athletic coaches and performing arts teachers think, if this is what we need our athletes to be able to do, is that really going to be the best drill that's going to give us that information? And this is not just so we to our students, so that it drives our actions as teachers. And what I provided just as a background for this is a little quick short assessment. And again, you're welcome to take it before, but I also think it's something that maybe you want to complete as we go through the day next Monday. And through each one of the questions, but I want to just kind of dig into that second question just for a second. My PLC chooses a process to identify skills and concepts in grade level content learning standards. We really think about what are the concepts and skills that are embedded within a standard we're going to teach, and is that what is the driver before we do anything else? And I think it's fair to say, is that all the time, most of the time, some of the time? So again, I'm not going to speak to each element of the instrument, but I at least wanted you to see it. You're welcome to kind of give it a once over and complete it before next Monday, or we'll have it present with us, and it's something we might do throughout the day. You also would see that element I'm kind of highlighting in the PLC Plus playbook in module 5 through 39 and 50. So these are just some extra instruments you might even consider providing your teachers, but there's an intentionality back to the playbook. And I'll go into more detail and make sure you feel comfortable with the materials when we're together next Monday. So question 2 is, where are we now? Which has everything to do with our formative assessment. But I want to say that means any type of assessment tool we use. That's our end of unit common assessment unit test. That's our quizzes. That's our homework. That's those quick intermediate assessments. It's also those initial assessments at the start of a unit. Anytime we can gather evidence on where our students are, we can use that question, where are we now? And I think this is where we have to respectfully protect teams from themselves. that they don't just get bogged down into that end of the unit assessment or that big common assessment at the end, which can sometimes provide information that's useful, and sometimes it could be an autopsy. What are the assessment tools in the interim, especially at the beginning of a unit? So we determine if there's any specific learning gaps our students have, and that's going to be more important starting this year than ever, because we know students are going to have a little bit more of the summer lag than they ever did before because of what we had to do last spring when we had to shut down. I know there's a lot on the screen. I'm going to pause momentarily. This would be one if you want to pause the webinar to digest one of the research elements that really underpin question 2, which is John Hattie's teacher estimates of achievement. I'm going to go ahead and pause for a second, but I'd encourage you to pause the recording and let you digest that statement. All righty. Again, I would always encourage on a webinar, just try to keep the amount of time shorter so you always have the ability to pause. But there's a lot in this. And when we as a team, also individually, obviously as a teacher, really understand where our students are related to what our clarity was, it helps us better determine our classroom activities, the difficulty of the tasks we want to provide, how we group students, how we use questioning. And so not that it's not important when we're looking at individual students, but even more when we look at the collective, what is our best move that's going to move the learning forward for as many students as possible? Which leads me now into question number 3 momentarily. But first, I wanted to highlight in the instrument for question 2, back to what I shared a moment ago. We unwrap the standard, we think about the concepts and skills, but take a look at that first question. My team uses multiple ways to gather evidence of student learning against the concepts and skills. That means we can't just look at the entire assessment all the time. We're looking at specific items, or we're going to have a specific short assessment that is only focusing on some specific skills so we can better determine where our students are. Because what happens when we don't do that, we might say anybody over 80% goes over there and gets, with my fingers, that treatment. Well, the problem with that is what if that 80% represents 5 or 6 different skill gaps? As opposed to saying, let's look at items 1, 2, 3, 6, 19, and 24, because that addressed this skill, and any student that misses at least 3 of those, they're the ones that are going to get that specific different instructional action or that tier 2 strategy. So again, what you see between, I'm just kind of highlighting, I'm not going to speak to each element of the instrument, but I wanted to highlight that point that sometimes we have question 1, we say, yeah, we analyze that standard, we pull apart the concepts and skills, but then we don't maybe do as much with it as we could, possibly, maybe for some of your teams. The third question is, how do we move learning forward? And I want to be intentional here about how this question was designed. We feel very passionately when we look at John Hattie's research that it is maybe not in a team's best interest to think up front that we should differentiate first. For example, what do I do for the students who are proficient, and what do we do for the students that aren't? As opposed to, how do we move learning forward for all students? Because it's possible, more often than not, and even probable, sometimes both groups of students are going to need the same thing. Some might get it more. And so let's think first, how do we move learning forward for all students? And certainly we will talk about the need to differentiate and provide different strategies and into tier 2 and tier 3 in an RTI model. But we start first with, how do we move the learning forward for all students? And I would imagine, as I kind of finish up this question, this is where a lot of us have kind of understood PLCs up until now. But we wanted to design this question with a little bit more intentionality, specifically driven a lot by Hattie's work. Here's another quote from John that I know we can read, but I'm going to go ahead and read this one to you. The beliefs and conceptions held by teachers need to be questioned, not because they are wrong or right, but because the essence of good teaching is that teachers' expectations and conceptions must be subjected to debate, being refuted, it's a tough word to say when I'm on a roll, and investigation, refutation. Got tongue-tied there. Only then can there be major improvements in achievement. And what I'm highlighting here is this is what makes our profession a practice. Doctors practice medicine. Lawyers practice law. Teachers practice teaching. And if you ask the teacher, what do you do for a living? And I say, would you ever say you practice teaching? A lot of times they'll get a smirk, and I'm like, why? There are some things that work better than others that move learning forward, but we have to figure how we implement them. Just like a lawyer has to apply state statute and case law, to an individual case, and like a doctor has to apply the laws of medicine and medical science to that individual patient and their family history and their body chemistry and all those other things. And when you think about your sporting coaches, football, basketball, other sports, not every coaching meeting is harmonious. There's debate, there's challenge, there should be challenge, respectful challenge, of course, but this has to be part of our discussion. It has to be part of our ongoing dialogue. And one of the things that we want to maybe start with is abandoning instructional practices that are simply not evidence-based. In fact, there's evidence against them. Round-robin reading is actually detrimental to students reading most of the time. It is a very ineffective practice. We'll talk about what retention could look like, but I think we can all look at the retention at the elementary level, but I sometimes wonder, how do we attack it at the secondary level? As a former secondary teacher and administrator, and I've written at least one book specifically on secondary grading practices. And one of my wonders, and I'm not saying I'm right about this, is I think it's kind of interesting sometimes. We'll tell a student, you cannot make up that assignment, you cannot make up that quiz, but you can make up the whole semester instead. I have to ask ourselves, is that really a practice that has any evidence behind it? Because I think we would acknowledge the research says it doesn't. So, as I mentioned, up until now, it's probably a pretty good, solid overview of what maybe some things we've been used to before. Question 4, what did we learn today? What a concept. A consistent opportunity to go, what did we learn? Where was our reflection that lets us step back and go, all right, we just met for the last 30 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever it is. And I know we've all been there, where we walk out of a meeting and we go, what the heck did we just decide? How do we help support our teams to structure their meetings so there's a consistent opportunity to reflect on their practice, on their discussion, and that might mean that they do less, but they do it with so much more quality and they feel that they are moving forward and they have their arms around it. One of the things that drives that are having solid norms, and norms are not, we're on time, prepared, we're respectful. Those are not norms. Those are standards. In fact, by definition, a norm is something that you have to work at to develop normal behavior. Now, I don't know, you should have to work at showing up on time, although we know some people that do. For an example, a norm might be that we don't assume a universal understanding of instructional strategies. What do I mean by that? Is that that's our norm, and Dave says, I think we could do some reciprocal teaching with this group. Somebody should say, okay, Dave, explain what you mean by reciprocal teaching. What does that look like to you? They're not questioning my competence. They're making sure that my understanding is their understanding. And when we have the norms posted, then it's the norm that made Dave explain his thinking, not an individual person. And that's something that probably would drive a lot of efficiency into our teams, and certainly is a good starting point. So as I'm walking you through the 5 questions here today, and we will next Monday, we might see what are opportunities, for example, right with question 4, that maybe that's an entry point with some groups. And then question 5, who benefited and who did not? And this goes back to, while I said earlier, there's a value of equity embedded throughout each of the questions. This specific question addresses it. And why I love having this question as part of the framework, it will force and allow teams to have a deep, structured conversation around equity, as opposed to sometimes the superficial ones. Because equity discussions are not easy, and they're uncomfortable sometimes. Also, by having a question that there'll be a specific time to talk about equity, we won't have to feel bad if we're not always having an equity conversation. There's times when we're first, because of where we are in our cycle and our structure, we're going to look at all of our students because we got to get our arms around it. We're going to come back to the equity conversation, and then we can have a real deep, thick one. So, and I know we know this, but we'll talk about how do we make sure that we have equitable systems in place, that we are responding in more real time, because it's just part of how we do business as opposed to waiting to react. So I'm going to go deeper with that one when we're together next Monday. So I appreciate your time. I know I talked kind of fast. I was trying to keep it as short and concise as possible. I know you have so much on your plates. And again, some of you might not have a chance to watch this until after we're together. I'm hoping some of you can before. But I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody on the team next Monday morning. Have a great rest of your week. Be safe, and we'll talk then.